As is always the case in our world, the universe connected us with an extraordinary human in soul who happens to be a scientist and a healer, or as she would say to you, a life alchemist. Kristina Wiltsee is a change agent with an unbelievable number of intuitive tools ready to transform your life. Are you an overthinker? Do you struggle with your inner villain? Are you neurodivergent? Kristina's training as a scientist, experience as a business exec, and deep passion for spiritual connection allows her to network a broader set of tools, helping clients find happiness in their humanness. Her intuitive ability, along with her training in various modalities, helps her zero in right away on where you need to find healing and balance. Karen and I both had the opportunity to work with her, and whoa, we were blown away. She is also co-host of this Spiritual Fix podcast, which is an internationally recognized podcast that hits close to home for many people who are struggling for peace amidst the pain of trauma, emotional wounds, and neurodivergent brains. Kristina and her co-host Anna uncovered deeper layers of themselves, teaching with humor that there is nothing to fix, just more of ourselves to love. What is a life alchemist, and how can Kristina be a part of bringing you clarity, love, and the opportunity to play in power, health, and joy? It's time to find out. Let's get going. Hi, Kristina.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello, Karen and Robyn.
We're so excited to have you here as well. And there's so much to dig into in your background, especially fascinated from a scientific perspective, which is, I find, always intriguing as we dig into the spiritual stuff. Can we start with that term, life alchemist? What does that mean? Why do you call yourself a life alchemist?
Yes, it's a great question because it always provides an opportunity for me to kind of explain a bit more about what I do, because everyone's like, what is that exactly? There's one part of it, which I will totally admit is a personal joke for myself, having been a chemist and having worked as a chemist and gotten a degree as a chemist. I'm like, wouldn't it be hilarious if I go back to my college reunion and I'm like, hey, guess what, guys? I'm an alchemist. Isn't that great? Just rewound time a little bit. I wonder if you guys are okay with that. Are you okay with being associated? We always got to keep it light and laughter. It's all about that.
Yes.
So that's one aspect. The second aspect I would say is that what I do with my clients, one of my favorite things to do is that the way that I see the world is that it's always trying to talk to us in every single way possible. And so we can have moments of insight or epiphany or something like that, or synchronicity. And we're like, isn't that amazing? But there's so many opportunities in any given day with anything that's happening in your life to just be like, hey, actually, there's an epiphany right there. And there's an insight right there. And so taking the ingredients of our lives on any given day, I love working, especially the clients I work with regularly. I do alchemy sessions with them. We look and we say, what's going on in your life and what insights can we pull out of this? Are we seeing that there are some alchemical principles, stuff like as above, so below? There's a lot of things that go with alchemy itself, but just taking that ingredients, all the ingredients of everything that's happening during your day and finding the patterns that sit within them. And so that's why I really love the idea because of alchemy, because ultimately, if anyone's studied alchemy, they know that the whole point is creating the elixir of life. We interpret it as an immortal elixir. And effectively, that's what we're doing here, I see, on Earth in many ways. And it's not about living forever. It's about how do we connect with the eternal parts of ourselves and bring them into our daily lives all the time. We are divine, immortal beings living in mortal bodies. How do we combine the two so that we can live life in a more uplifted and effortless way and not having to really grind it out like so many of us can feel on many occasions?
Yes. I love the way they put that.
Well, and it was like what Robyn was saying in the intro about finding the happiness in our humanness, which I love because I feel like so many times we feel our humanness is heavy and it is something that we're dragging through life with versus looking for that joy and all, like you said, all the signs and reasons that we're here. What a wonderful way to approach life in general.
Yeah. I love pulling in literature and texts from all sorts of different sources. There's a Gnostic text, if anyone's familiar with the Gnostics. It's called the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and it's a historic document around those. And if anyone's familiar, she actually describes us as being on a process of becoming fully human. And I really enjoy that perspective because it's just like, oh man, so our human nature isn't this terrible, fighting, evil, corrupt self. we're all just in the process of growing up into becoming fully human beings. And our fully human being is that integrated divine and mortal self, right? I love it.
Oh my goodness. I needed that reminder today, especially. And I just love the way you've been able to integrate your whole journey so far into this definition of life alchemist. And speaking of which, can you talk about your childhood? You're the daughter of an actress and a scientist, and how that played a role into your journey as a seeker and where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the laws of alchemy is the law of polarity. And I can definitely say that I'm one of those. It's this idea that when you have these two kind of opposing forces, you can do a lot of movement and learning in that experience. And I feel in some ways I'm kind of the product of that, right? I had the actress who was very creative, and then the computer scientist who, was just very logical. Both of them were very spiritual in nature, which I'm so grateful for because they really supported that. But it was a fascinating journey for me because I feel that I was my mother's favorite. And as a result of that, when she passed when I was 6, I then swung to the other side and I was like, oh, I got to get in with this other parent. How can I become the scientist, right? How can I switch to the other polarity? Because it becomes a survival mechanism, even if you're not consciously aware of it. It's a lot of this is me looking back at that. And I feel as if I really have spent a lot of my life moving between a lot of extremes, whether it's abandonment and rejection. And it's like, I think a lot of us spend our whole lives swinging this pendulum back and forth between these different iterations. And I think I did it in a very extreme way. And I think that my upbringing and the polarity of my parents really lent itself to that journey. But what it's allowed me to do is to seek in the most magical sorts of ways, whether it was traveling in the actual world, traveling in the mind, or having every job under the sun, working as a scientist, working as an actress. I had a time as an actress, really going all around, having the full human experience as much as I could. I wanted to seek what it was like to be a human and how anybody could feel in any given situation. Always trying to follow some sort of innate je ne sais quoi, right? Of just like, oh, I think I'm going to do this. This sounds interesting. I'll work for Greenpeace, and then I'll work a sawmill, and then I'll do whatever it was. And so having gone through that, the motions of my life made it so that seeking in a spiritual way was just a natural part of that. It felt like it was the spirituality of both of my parents lending itself to being exposed to things like Reiki when I was very young, very alternative churches, unity churches, things along those lines when I was growing up. Going to sweat lodges as a kid, things along those lines all made it so that by the time that I was in my own seeking space, I was like, the world's my oyster. I can do anything. I'm not bound by any of this. And so I feel as if I've gotten more into a center, having swung wildly about for a long time. And I feel like I enjoy that center so much now, having done all of that physical and vocational seeking, spiritual seeking throughout my whole life before now.
I'm fascinated that you grew up with such a spiritual household, especially having your dad be a scientist. Can you just expand on that a little bit? What was infused in your head?
So I remember once my dad sat me down and he showed me a mug, a coffee mug, and he said, God is inside the mug and everybody is looking at the mug from a different perspective. And he said this to me. I mean, I was 7, 8 years old, something along those lines. And I was so fortunate that even though there was a lot of material and difficult things that happened for me as a child, that somehow both of my parents, despite all of their failures and faults and all of their good things and all the earthly things, somehow both had this very strong tolerance and openness to the spiritual. And it made it so that me as my Pisces self was able to flow freely in that space. The trauma, the difficulty all made it so I lost track of it a lot, but it was always that background. And so my dad was, he was a meteorologist, he was a computer scientist, but he always had this spiritual streak throughout, and he still does. And it's always just been so shocking to me because it doesn't feel like it fits with that kind of
unusual,
standard stereotype.
Yeah, factual world.
And like when your mom passed away, I don't know if it was something that was sudden or if it was something that was drawn out, but how was that dealt with in your home at that age?
She passed away from breast cancer and she'd been sick for most of my life. So I don't really honestly remember any time when she wasn't sick. And so for me, it was an interesting moment to recognize. I think in some ways it introduced me to this understanding that I have of how human metaphysics works, right? How the energy of humans works, because I could see my dad had a very rich spiritual life, but his emotional tenderness, nurturance, nourishment, that part wasn't necessarily as present. And his mind was extremely active. And so then I also saw that in myself. I could say, okay, somehow I can have this really rich spiritual life. I can have this really overthinking mind, but I can completely negate the subjective or the emotional. And for years, I did that. I remember thinking when I was 15 that art doesn't even need to exist. I had gone so far into the science and so far into the overthinking. And when I started to finally understand the way that human bodies work and the energies of, I was just like, oh, this makes perfect sense, because I could see how I could have one area that was alight and doing well and other parts that were just completely shut down, and what that kind of feels like in the world when you do that.
Do you have a connection with your mom now, spiritually? On the other side, does she still feel like she's present in your life, especially now as you're doing the work that you're doing?
Absolutely. It was funny because I have a couple of relationships with other psychics and other mediums and stuff like that. And there was one that he really broke open my relationship with my mom for me, because I dream about everybody. I can channel so much, but there was this huge block with her for many, many, many years. And it wasn't until I reached my silent anniversary. So I outlived her. So
Yeah.
she died when she was 39. And when I got to be 40, everything broke open for me. And my kids past the ages that my sister and I were when she passed, all of those things made it so that suddenly my relationship with her opened up. And I talk to her all the time now. And I love it because my daughter in particular is always just like, oh, Grandma Carrie's in the back seat. We just have this kind of ongoing relationship, especially because my daughter can sense spirits in that particular way that, like, oh, this is so cool. It's like she's come back into our lives in a beautiful way.
I've never heard of it put that way. I never realized that you could call it that, silent anniversary. How extraordinary.
I love these stories now of children, because as a child, young adult, going through the trauma of that experience. But I always think about the parent too on the other side, who is probably so close and just wanting so much that connection with their child, and how incredibly magical it must be for them when that can finally happen and they can come reemerge into your life in maybe even a more relevant way in some senses, because they can be that higher guidance, even though you want them there, but they still can be there. So I just love hearing that opened up for you, Kristina. I also love what you were saying earlier about being a water sign. And I can see how that was, as a Pisces, that would be so needed, like that fluidity of being able to navigate this world. Talk a little bit about your traveling experiences, because you learned so much from what we know about yourself, about the world, about who you are as a soul.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such a fascinating thing, because oftentimes we can see our wounds as really propelling us into negative places, or like always pushing us into relationships that we don't want, or things like that. I am so incredibly grateful for my wounds, because I would say parts of me that were restless because I didn't want to stay put, because I was afraid of rejection and therefore rejecting as a result, made it so that I was like, all right, I'm going to go travel everywhere. And I was able to live in Australia in high school. And it was funny because I was going to go because, again, I wanted to go to the other side of the world. My home life was very difficult at the time. And I was like, what solution can we find? Let's literally go to the other side of the world. And then it turns out that my family went there. Something happened and somebody got a job transfer and was able to go there. And it was like, I was so incredibly privileged and just so lucky to be able to see this world and to be able to open up and see that the world that I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and the United States was just so incredibly limited, and that there was so much out there in the world that intellect couldn't even touch. There were experiences that I had become very driven, very like, oh, it's all about thinking. Going into Australia made it so that I could suddenly open up and recognize the benefit of connection and friends and things like that, which I had really kind of denied myself a lot, or had not really, being a very neurodivergent person, not really necessarily had a lot of very close friends up until moving. And so I could kind of reinvent myself when I went there. And it was the first of many. That was one of those pendulum swings of like, oh, let's just I'll just become a totally different person. How does that sound, right?
Well, the mom actress in you.
Exactly. So that was the first experience. And so then I came back to the States and I went to college and I did everything like that. And then by one of those kismet opportunities, met this Kiwi in a bar in the middle of Montana when I was on a road trip, decided to move to New Zealand. And he was a meditator. So you could see this like crazy confluence of situations that happened such that I met this man. I sat next to him at a bar in the middle of a place that I was staying for a single night and then kept in contact with him. He invited me to go to New Zealand and I was like, yeah, great. I love going to the other side of the world. That's totally my jam. So I up and went. And I think a part of me knew that it would be a very difficult journey. I think a part of me knew that one in particular, because I wasn't going with my family. I was going with a guy I barely knew who had his own kind of miraculous story. He had had cancer and had used herbs to get over and get his cancer into remission. And I was like, oh man, that goes straight into my whole cancer trigger trauma. I love this. And so you can see how it all just works out in that way. And he introduced me to Vipassana meditation and the 10-day meditations retreat that SN Goenka does. I would do them all the time in New Zealand. And I just became a meditator and I became a Buddhist and an herbalist. And I got very much so into herbs. And I just started to reconnect with nature when I was there. And it was amazing. And then it keeps going, right? And then I was like, oh, I want to get out of this relationship, but I don't know how. So I'm going to do my typical kind of toxic way of doing it is I'm just going to plan a trip around the world. And that'll be my excuse to break up with this guy.
Of course.
Doesn't everybody do that?
I'm nothing if not a little bit original in my evasiveness that I had in my toxic traits growing up. Yeah. And so then going around the world and traveling for long periods of time, doing a lot of meditation, going into the Himalayas, doing all sorts of stuff in Thailand, traveling all through Eastern Europe and Turkey and all these different places. It introduced me to this world to recognize that the world that I held as the best or whatever it was, it's just so much richer when we incorporate as much as we can of other people's cultures and that we introduce ourselves to them. So it helped so much with my spiritual journey. And I also learned how to palm read, which is how I first kind of discovered that I was psychic.
We need to hear about the palm reading.
It was so funny. I was in Nepal and I was at a bookstore. And one of my favorite things to do when I was traveling by myself was just to go to a bookstore, find tea, have whatever, and just sit down with books for ages on end, which is hilarious because, like, why do you need to go to another country to do that? But
somehow there's permission to do that there. I don't know.
Exactly. So I was like, I'm going to learn how to palm read because then maybe I can make money by just doing quick palm readings everywhere. And so I started to learn how to do it. And then I found out I was really good at it. And I was talking to people about themselves and I was like, where is this coming from? I don't even understand where this is coming from. And I would have these magical moments with people and I wouldn't even be speaking their language sometimes. Would there be a translator? I was able to see and talk. I remember once I accidentally outed this mother to her son that she had had another child that had died at a young age. And this was like a fully grown adult son. And she like accidentally outed this. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry.
I mean, these are the things that you open your, but like, we totally get that and how that happened when you start.
Exactly.
Yes.
So that was sort of like your gateway, right?
Yeah. And how was that coming to you in terms of, was it a knowing? Was it clairvoyance or clairaudience? Like, was it all of it?
It's funny because my guides are funny now because they joke with me. They're like, the only way that we could actually get you to understand your intuition was through your voice because you always like to talk. And so we'll just infuse a bunch of knowledge into your normal stream of consciousness. And then suddenly, so it was like, I was not aware of it at all. In fact, somebody, Anna, who I do the podcast with, she calls it being a mentalist, where it just comes into your head. You don't know. You're not aware that it's coming from a different source, especially when you're first starting out and it's just coming out of your mouth or it's coming out of your fingers because you're typing it, or you just know the answers to trivia questions, which apparently that was an early manifestation of my psychic ability was that I could always answer trivia questions and everyone would be like, where did that come from? It's very useful. It's handy. It's a good
I mean, I want you on my team. That's unbelievable.
I have to say, one thing that just came into my mind was back to what you said about your dad and that cup and how your travel experience actually gave you that opportunity to really see from different cultures and different perspectives. It really was a really good metaphor for the journey that you took. Also about how you met your husband and then your children as well, how their influence, talk about and spirit family, like they taught you a lot as well.
They did. Absolutely. It was one of those moments where, especially meeting my husband, was one of those moments where I was so not on board with this experience at all. And I was just dragged along kicking and screaming. The New Zealand boyfriend, I finally broken up with him. And I was like, all right, I'm finally going to break up with this guy. I'd been traveling, I had been away. I finally actually had to get on the call and like not be avoidant and be like, hey, we're going to actually break up. And 3 days later, my husband walks into the place that I'm working at. And it was just like...
Where were you, by the way, at the time?
At the time, I had come back to Atlanta. I was living in my parents' house. I was working at a plant nursery. I had basically like all of my education and everything had just been completely stripped away. And I was like, I don't know what I want to do. I've just come out of this huge trip. I've been gone for 5 years, traveling around the world and living in New Zealand. I don't know what's going on. So I just went down to my local plant nursery because I knew that I had this affinity for plants and herbs and medicinal herbs in particular. And I was like, can I have a job? And they were like, yes, great. And so then I had been working there for a couple of months and broke up with my Kiwi boyfriend, and my husband walks in the door. And the kicking and screaming part was that I was like, I want to be single. I haven't been single for a very long time. I'd been dating this guy for 5 years. I was like, don't want any part of it. And he was so wonderful and so devoted and just so amazing. And it wasn't until he was finally like, you are so not into this. I have to break up with you because you're not into this, that I finally, some psychological switch happened. And I was like, okay, maybe I'll be interested in this.
Wow.
And it was one of those things where there was so many subconscious parts of me that knew that he was the person, but all of the toxic, more conscious parts of me at that time didn't know. And in some ways, they lost their kind of resistance. They were still present. It took me a very long time for my conscious self to fall fully in love with him. And I think a lot of it was happening underneath the surface. And I think a lot of people can find that if they've had avoidant, anxious attachment of some sort, that we rarely ever go into a relationship when we're not wounded in some way. It's just a matter of who it is that we choose to go to bed with, this is the terminology, who it is that we choose to go to bed with, so that when we wake up, we're like, oh, I'm waking up next to you. It's like you kind of both simultaneously wake up, or you have your own journey, in the sense that there was a lot working, because my tendency was to be very avoidant and to be very not wanting to have anything to do with this. And so my mom always comes in and we worked so hard to try and just get you to ignore the fact that you didn't want to be in a relationship, because we knew how important this relationship would be for you. And so it's been a whirlwind of building houses and being homesteaders and living off grid, having my daughter. And that's when my psychic abilities really came up, really just busted straight open, was when my daughter was born. And then my son, a couple of years later, brought another level of understanding. And so truly, I believe that the transformation that my kids had was what was fundamental to me becoming the psychic and the channel that I am today, because I had to grow up so much.
Yeah.
And that part of me, the kind of eternal child that was still living in that younger self, had to grow up. And without that part, I couldn't be doing what I am today. And I'm so grateful to my kids for that.
Was there something that triggered that with your daughter?
It's always those dark nights of the soul. I had a home birth with my daughter, and I went into almost a form of postpartum psychosis. Like, that would be the technical, clinical description of it. A teacher and shaman friend of mine did a clearing on me, and she was like, your body was a smorgasbord for ghosts. She's like,
wow.
She's like, you brought something through the veil, which was your daughter, and then you brought through everything else. And it was insanity. I look back at that time now, and I'm just like, it was so hard. It was so hard to not be going into panic attacks. There's a lot of hormonal stuff. Again, this is one of those things that in hindsight, I can say, why was I imbalanced? Okay, well, a hormonal was a representative of something that was happening to me energetically. And I had all of these healing teachers, healers, who were literally coming in and teaching me different ways to heal as they were healing me. And it was so fundamental to my energy healing work and understanding that time period. I would be going through a period of manic, and I could have all these intrusive thoughts were going on, and I could just feel all of my sensitivities were through the roof. And then I would call this person, and she'd be like, all right, just turn your head to the right. And all of a sudden it would go away, and I would be fine again. And I experienced this radical healing from this one healer, as well as my shaman friend. Like, both of them were fundamental at that time. And it really convinced me and helped me know that there was another way of doing things.
Well, and especially you coming from this very scientific background.
Medical pre-med background. I was totally convinced for years that all I was going to do was going to be a medical doctor.
What happened?
And
What was the epiphany for you?
you'd find this funny. It's funny that I say that my psychic abilities started with my daughter in my early 30s, because actually there were multiple things. There was the palm reading, but then there was also, I went to a medical workshop weekend for pre-med students when I was in college. And I went into the room full of cadavers and I could see and feel them all. And I was like, uh-oh.
Didn't I just like walk right out? Like, what did you do? That's heavy. Did you tell anybody about that?
I didn't at the time. It was one of those things where you're just like, okay, maybe this is what everybody feels when they go into those things. It's like when you're young and you haven't really connected the dots, you're just, oh, this must be what everybody feels, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then the physical empath, being a physical empath where you can feel the pain that other people are having in their bodies, that had started a couple of years earlier, but it really ramped up when I started to see people in an informal manner who were hurt, right? Like I could be like, oh my God, I can feel that in my body. And I was like, this is not going to work. I'm not going to be able to be a medical doctor and have to go through all the training with this almost debilitating sensitivity.
Wow.
Holy mackerel. I love the uh-oh.
So then after you have your daughter and you are learning that there are these very real ways of utilizing energy and so forth to heal. From there, how did you get to where you are now? What did you start to study? What were the wounds you uncovered? How'd that work?
Yeah, so that was this amazing journey. So Anna, the co-host of the podcast, The Spiritual Fix with Me, it started with her when I was in those really dark postpartum depression days, postpartum anxiety days. We just started doing random things. I started doing Arcturian technologies, and literally we just started texting each other. We couldn't talk to each other because we both had young kids, and we just started texting each other and being like, hey, what does this feel like? And I was noticing that I was actually starting to feel better with some of these things. I was feeling better. I was getting more clarity. Everything was opening up. And 6 months into our text chain, we both realized that we both started actively channeling. She was channeling Archangel Michael mostly, and I was channeling Archangel Uriel at the time. And we were like recognizing and opening up to all of these experiences. And so for years, it was just our text chain going back and forth. Hey, I found this thing. Hey, I found this thing, right? Which is a joke. This spiritual fix, it's like it's a joke because for a while there, it was like a fix. We were just like, hey, did you find the next new thing? Yeah, let's do that. Of course, it morphed into this understanding that there isn't anything to fix. But going through that experience and opening up my psychic channels was a journey that I did because of my kids, but with my friend Anna. So much of the journey that you hear in the podcast it starts a couple of years after we did that. Obviously, it starts 6 years after we kind of started this text chain, but a lot of it is about all the things that we learned and all the different technologies, all the different processes, all the different everything along those lines. And so there was a slow start with understanding my psychic connection for all those years. But when the podcast started, that's when I think everything went into hyperdrive, because we used the podcast as the vehicle for actually healing our stuff, right? And there's the first season, we talk about the primal wounds, for instance, and the primal wounds are injustice, rejection, betrayal, abandonment, and humiliation. And that was the first lens that I looked at through everything. Mm-hmm. And we went through them once before the podcast started, and it was difficult. And then we went through it again when we actually did the recording of the podcast, and it was incredibly difficult. And the podcast basically is a journey of the two of our shadow work together. First, it came through the primal wounds, and then it was the drama triangle. And then each season kind of has its own, different thing. Like to the point where in the second season where we talk about the drama triangle, we got into a huge fight. And we literally had to talk about our fight and moving through it through the lens of the drama triangle of like, who's playing the victim right now? Who's playing the rescuer? Who's playing the persecutor? Recognizing that we were all coming through there. So the podcast is almost a verbal journal of my healing process in many ways, because we were having to live it in real time, right? And so some of it we got from other sources, but a lot of it we just started channeling. So for instance, the mother wound, there's some really wonderful stuff on the mother wound by Kelly McDaniel. She does Mother Hunger, that book. It's a great, fantastic thing. How we interpreted that became part of our channel and moving through our own wounds and how we worked through it. And the father wound, God, there's nothing on the father wound. It's almost all religious if there's anything about it. And so we had to channel it and figure out what is the father wound and what does that look like. And so that was a real opportunity for me just around the first times I started doing that. I started seeing people and recognizing that I was very psychic and that I was very able to kind of help, not only like talk to people and give them information and insights, but actually help them, because that was really where my heart lie, right? Which is in the process of telling people not just about insights that they can gather. Oh, I'm not a timeline psychic. I'm not into that part, because I fundamentally know and believe and see everybody for their divine self. And my job is to pull out that understanding in everybody that I come across. And the podcast helped me do that, because the podcast is about the self guru. It's about how are you enabling yourself to become your own guru.
What's your definition of a guru?
I think that a guru is somebody who has perspective, and they have a different perspective, and they're able to offer you a different perspective. I think in a traditional sense, a guru is, I kind of see everything in a 3-path sort of thing. The first path, which is what I call is finding your miraculous moment, is plant medicine, because a guru could be a plant. It's got a very standard way of doing something, right? It's like, you're going to take me and then I'm going to take you on a journey. So a plant itself could be a guru. Obviously, it comes from traditional India and Hinduism, and that's where the terminology originally comes from. But there are a lot of people who, in their spirituality, stay on that path. They stay on the place where they want somebody to give them their miraculous moment. And they'll keep going to different teachers, getting miraculous moments all the time. And maybe they're going to spend their whole life and many lives following somebody else who's going to tell them how they need to use and interact with their spirituality. The second path is that self-guru, I say, which is where everybody recognizes that they need to develop their own tools for how it is that they know that something is right for them. They're gaining perspective of their own life. They're able to see themselves relatively quickly after something goes wrong. They're able to like, oh, I have perspective on this. I can see this and I can see what I'm doing here. And then they use the tools and they find a community, a sangha, to basically walk down that path with. And so there's a lot of parallel play in that. Parallel play traditionally is attributed to toddlers who are like playing next to each other, but not with each other. But part of the community is that we process stuff so that everybody doesn't have to process everything, right? You learn so much by processing next to a person so that you don't have to do it.
Yeah.
That's really tough.
Yeah. And then the third path is what I call the miraculous sphere, which is where you're providing that for other people. You may be providing them path 1 experiences or path 2, but you've gone into the service. And that's a long-winded answer.
I think people have different perceptions of what a guru is. Many, I'm sure, don't even think of themselves as being one, let alone for themselves. I think that tough one is a good segue into how you're now working with people. Talk a little bit about that, Kristina, like what a session's like with you, but then the follow-up that you like to do with people that you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. So I work with people in probably 2 different ways. I do spotlight sessions, which are that miraculous moment. It's, hey, you need some insight, you need some shifting in your energy. And when we go into a session, I'm doing a lot of channeling, I'm answering a question, and there's energy healing that's going on in the background. And so my journey has helped me coalesce a number of different energy healing processes and channeled a new, it's not new, nothing's new, but a system for kind of helping people to move through whatever it is they're happening. So when I have a spotlight session with someone, it's usually there to make an impact in whatever way possible. And I really enjoy doing that. But most of the time when I do at this point is I help people and I move them through into their path 2, right? Into their place of their self-guru, recognizing that a lot of people sit in their wounded space. I call them the inner villains. There's these parts of us, these almost universes that we will live in, and we will think that they are everything. And we will have lost touch with the center of who we are because we've swung our own pendulum into some reality. Maybe it's the perfectionist. Maybe it's being the evasive expert and you're compartmentalizing everything. Maybe it's being the righteous bully and you're always trying to protect people and you're bulldozing everything in the process of doing it. We have these inner villains and they are wanting to complete their arc into the hero, into the legend. And so I work with people in series of practicums. So we do 12 sessions as an example, and then we'll have a 2-hour kind of discovery where people can just download everything that they need to. And I'll create a curriculum. And we're just working them through getting into a place where they can refine their center and where they can truly come to love themselves and be given the tools whatever those tools are, lucid dreaming, holotropic breath work, whatever it is, all of this is in service of you. And how can you understand that for kind of creating your own custom instruction manual for how to live in the world?
Wow. That's so comprehensive. And you've obviously studied so much in order to be able to create a plan such as that. And to also, in an authentic and kind way, help channel and help someone see for themselves what is going on. So that's unbelievable. Something that you do called enterogenics. What is that?
Yes. So it's funny because when I channeled this new energy healing, I was like, what is this called, guys? I didn't have a name for the longest time. And I thankfully got in a partnership with this incredible creative consultant who is a friend of mine who I used to work with. She calls herself a brand alchemist because that's very much so what she does. And I was sitting here and I was like trying to explain to her the overview of everything that I do, right? Because it can be really hard. Everything is curious for me. I love everything. I want to be able to do it. Focusing has never necessarily been my strong suit when it comes to the things that I want to do and that I want to bring into the world. And I was telling her about sensory reckoning. Sensory reckoning is a module that I do for people who are neurodivergent, who find it very difficult to handle sensory sensitivities. It's something that I've struggled with. And generally, I do believe that most people have a sensory sensitivity of some sort. Some people may be very sensitive to the past and thus are very easily triggered. Some people may be very sensitive to the future and are thus very, very anxious. And so we think of the senses as, the 5 or the 8, depending on who you're talking to, but it goes well beyond that. And so interoception is a type of sense. It's the sense of I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm something along that. Exteroception is your ability to judge other people's emotions and things that are going on in the outside world. So the term entero is a play on that. It's a play on an understanding. Entero, it's like entire energy, energetics, right? It was like energetics, enterogetics. So it has a lot to do with this understanding that ultimately, as one of the key parts of that instruction manual for us, that custom instruction manual is understanding how our sensitivities and how our sensory system works so that we can better exist with the world itself. So that's where that comes from.
It's brilliant.
It always blows my mind, first, how little most of us know ourselves. But then secondly, we say this all the time, how many layers of ourselves there are. If we could get to know even some of them, it would really help guide our journey in such a different way and such an authentic way. And so I love this modality that you come up with. And I love the fact that you're able to bridge a little of that woo with the science. Because they do work so magically together.
They do.
Yeah. And there's no coincidence. That's how you were literally brought into this world and raised. And before we forget, I also want to ask you something that you said earlier about Arcturian technologies. For those who don't know what that means, can you just expand on that? Because I'm sure people are like, what was she talking about? I was nodding, and so was Karen, because I know we've read about some of this, but it'd be wonderful if you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wish you could see Kristina's face. She's like, oh, she's going to call me on that one.
Because it's so funny. It is really funny because that's the thing. Okay, so Arcturian, one of the things that I find so magical about this time is that there are so many different communities within the spiritual world. And the Starseed community, if anybody here is from the Starseed community, then they're going to know about Arcturians, which are benevolent beings who have transcended the need for the physical form. And the idea is that they're kind of sitting on a spaceship. Their community is sitting on it's not really a spaceship. It's a lot bigger than that, maybe, but helping people on Earth. And the technologies, you can look it up and you can be like, oh, what's the technology? And it's like, you ask for Lord Arcturus, who's the head of the Arcturians, to bestow upon you a certain type of technology. I used golden cylinder healing at the time. That was what I used. And again, it's like, that's the thing that I love about this is like, okay, so if you're open-minded and curious enough about all of this kind of stuff, you may do that, or you may be listening to me being like, this is absolutely insane. Like, what is she even talking about? She's asking an alien who's sitting on a spaceship above Earth to give her sort of golden suit. Like, I mean, what?
Why not?
Exactly. Why not?
I mean, why not?
You live in a crazy world, Kristina, for sure.
And when you are a woman who has literally been breastfeeding a child, doesn't know who she is, lost her identity, like literally gone through the energetic washing machine, and you get her to sit down on a bed for 10 minutes apiece, and she's allowed to call on Lord Arcturus for golden cylinder healing. And then I feel it. I feel it literally like in every cell of my body. It's like my body warms up. It's just like I started to actually feel it. I'm a very kinesthetic person, so a lot of the stuff comes through that way. It's like, yeah, I'm going to try it, right? And that's what I'm talking about when it comes to knowing your internal yes and no, and knowing your internal decision making, because someone could hear me say that and be like, that sounds amazing. I'm going to try that. I'm going to go look that up, and I'm going to just ask Lord Arcturus for golden cylinder healing, right? And that's going to be the thing for them. And then there are going to be other people who may feel revulsion.
Right.
They're just like, no, that's not me.
You're so right.
And that's okay. And we say that all the time. Like, that's why we follow all of these different modalities ourselves. Some are fascinating and inspirational and exciting. And some are like, ooh, it's just a little too much for me. And that's okay.
Yeah. And so many of these things, like you're talking about, first of all, you were curious enough about it, and it's free. Like, it didn't cost you anything to talk to Lord Arcturus. You know what I mean? It costs you and it costs you nothing. Try it.
I'm so glad you followed up on that question, Robyn, because I thought about it too. And then I'm like, I really want to hire.
As someone who's interested in Starseed, there's semblance of all of us from these different energies. I'm like, yeah, let's talk about it.
So Robyn and I gifted us a session each, your spotlight session. So I'm glad to have a moment to talk about what that was. Can you just dive a little bit deeper, though, into how that experience works for you? So do you meditate ahead of time just to kind of connect with that person? Do you go into the session and just communicate what it is you're seeing, feeling, hearing? Talk us through what someone who comes to you might expect in a spotlight session.
I always love to assure people that there's no studying beforehand. I used to connect beforehand, but when I connected beforehand, my mind got way too involved. And ultimately, my job is to come in as blank of a slate as I possibly can, and to just speak and not get in the way. I think that for anyone who is starting out in their intuition, even if they're starting out trying to see people in that way, everyone's going to work a little bit differently about how they do it. But for me, it's very, very important to not let any expectation or mind get in the way. And then it's just whatever I see and feel. So I'll take a couple moments to tune in, and I'm tuning in for the first time in that moment. I can feel and maybe get a couple of things beforehand, but in general, I'm waiting for that moment until we are sitting there face to face. And that's when I'm connecting. And then oftentimes it'll come as a vision. It'll come as some sort of vision. And it's not with my physical eyes, it's in my mind's eye, which is what I call my shamanic plane. It's the place where so much work happens. It's a place where so much work happens for all of us. It's how we access the etheric planes and all the places that kind of exist in the collective unconscious or the collective consciousness, depending on how you say it. And so I'll either see something or I'll feel something in my physical body, and then I'll be able to translate that. And oftentimes, being the fact that feeling was that the mentalist was the first thing that came through, I trust my voice inherently to say what needs to be said. Sometimes I have to call back that voice because I recognize that there's a lot that needs to be said, and people can't necessarily take a humongous stream of information. And so I try to do my best to kind of be like, do you need a sec? Are we good? Can we keep going? And then sometimes, but it has a lot to do with the other person and how they're processing the information. So I've noticed that if somebody I'm talking to has more clairvoyant tendencies, their guides are communicating more clairvoyantly, then I will receive information more clairvoyantly. Whereas if they're more clairaudient or they're more kinesthetic, then I'm going to feel one of those come up stronger. And so when someone comes into a session, we're usually doing a general, this is what is the thing that is top of mind for your guides and for your higher self to say to you right now. And then as we move on, they can ask questions, and then we can answer in whatever way possible. I also really enjoy doing processes with people. I think that that's the product of what I'm talking about, of trying to give people the tools. That insight and epiphanies are beautiful and they're wonderful to give to the mind, but it's so important to let everything come along on the journey if we can. And if someone can go into a meditation and actually unlock something in that moment or heal it in that moment, then brilliant, let's do it. That's what it's like in a spotlight session. It's talking and questions back and forth, but then there can also be processes and healing in the background.
And we can both say that you were, as Karen said, you were just so on point. And I didn't even have a chance to catch up with you after hours. But what I wanted to say to you today is that one of the things that immediately, to your point of like, you really kept connecting in right when we got on Zoom, which you would never have known, is that that particular moment and that particular day, we had been raising this puppy we had for almost a month. And we were having a lot of issues with this puppy. I had 2 dogs, and we had lost one of our dogs unexpectedly in a recent time before getting this puppy. We thought this puppy was going to help our other dog as we all were grieving the loss of our other dog. And so we were hopeful with this dog. It was a mutt. And as it was getting bigger over these weeks, it was becoming more and more aggressive and more dominant in general, especially over our other dog, who was a small dog and was getting kind of pummeled every single day. And we were getting bit aggressively. And we were trying to do all the right things. We had spoken to someone the day before that you and I met, and that person was a professional trainer and someone we trust very much. And they told us, listen, this is going to be quite the commitment. And so you're talking at least a year of some sort of obedience training to get this dog to be at least obedient. And at the same time, you're really impacting this other dog. So we made the decision to bring this dog back to the place where we had rescued it, and with their assurance that they were going to help find another home and we would be in touch about it. My husband had gone literally within the hour that you and I talked to bring the dog back to the rescue. And so when we got on, and I was really broken up about it because it was heartbreaking, and yet I knew it was the right thing to do. So I was already starting in grief, I would say. And the first thing you said to me was, you are in such deep grief. And no one would know that. And from there went on to discuss many other impacts and triggers that was having for me and ways to work through that. And this was all just in a half-hour session, everybody. But I couldn't even explain to you the extent of it because I couldn't even explain it to myself because it was so fresh. But that is where you zeroed in. And I couldn't believe that's what you were picking up when I couldn't have explained to anybody what I was feeling. So I just wanted to say that to you, and for anybody listening or watching, that is how tapped in you are, Kristina. And then the exercises that we went through and everything that we discussed, even in just 30 minutes, was so profoundly helpful for me in processing and clearing a lot of that out over weeks. I just needed to say that.
Thank you. So glad. I'm so glad to hear that. It's wonderful. And I'm so glad that I was able to help.
Thank you.
It's also wonderful to hear because I
didn't even get a chance to properly thank you. And so I'm really grateful I have that chance right now. So thank you. And Karen, you were blown away.
I was, in just the sense that you were able, just like with Robyn, to zoom in. I had such a different scenario. I don't know if you remember it, Kristina, but right before the call, I got a call from my bank, and it was like, I'd been getting all these weird texts. I was worried. There was a lot of stuff going on around accounts being hacked into at that point. And so I literally was coming off one call and had 5 minutes to check to make sure everything in my account was okay. Turned out it was, but I was a little late to our conversation and I was really rattled, and I talked to you about it. And then we kind of like went on from there. You tapped into so many things in addition to that scenario. But then I had ended up asking you this question about finances later, about getting funding for Seeking Center. And you were able to tie that crazy moment that happened with my account and say, Kieran, look, everything ended up fine. And if in January you're feeling like you don't have that funding yet, I want you to go back to this moment and remember that everything is going to be okay. Remember how to feel. And that was such a relief for me that has stuck with me every single moment that I end up worrying about. I always go back to that. It's like, it reminds me I've always been okay and I will be okay. I can align with that emotion of that moment when we first got on the call with what okay actually feels like. And that was just so helpful. I mean, the whole call was great, but that was really a resonant takeaway for me that I think is really important over the next 6 months. So thank you for that too.
And it's that alchemy, right? That's what I call it, right? Which is this recognition of everything is always speaking to you. And if you have the lens and the perspective, then hopefully you can, like, the world, the universe is just reaching out to you, being like, we love you. We love you. We're going to use all the methods we can to get to that.
It's so true, because in that moment of that phone call, even though I was relieved that everything was okay, I was like, oh, why is this happening to me? Right. And then so to your point, it's like looking at the end result versus the negative nuisance that that experience actually was. And you're right. The more we can do that in our day to day, the more we can start to piece together all the learnings that we're actually here to learn. So it's just so helpful. But your ability, I feel like, for those listening, to really tap in to my energetic frequency immediately and give me sort of the visuals that you were seeing. Like, I remember one of them for me was that I was this horse. I was tied to this horse that was really erratic because there was so much going on and there were so many decisions to be made. And even putting that back in my head when I'm feeling that sense of overwhelmment and realizing, like, that's what I'm experiencing. It's okay. Giving myself a visual tool to associate with that emotion that can calm me down. And how you can do that in 30 minutes and to be so poignant and on target was really.
And being able to pull the right healing, the right prescription in some ways for each person is so different. And you're able to do that in addition to this, the tapping in to what is going on. Then it's the now what? How can we help you move through this? And I think that's such a unique ability. It's such a gift. And it shows how with all that you have learned and continue to learn, you're able to pull it in such a meaningful way. That's what makes you you. And we're so grateful to be connected.
To your point, Kristina, about having almost a little mini curriculum to go with the after is, yes, it's great to have this spotlight moment, this wow moment where all these ahas come to light. But then what do you do with those? And yes, the takeaways that you gave us are great to really utilize that insight and to be able to really work with that to the alchemy that you talked about for that balance and for that understanding that we're all looking for is really unique.
I mean, and being able to have those kinds of programs that you offer for somebody to really do the deep work, to see the even more profound transformation is so worthwhile when people are ready to do it. Because that's the other part is they need to be at that point where they want to change. Don't you think so?
I do. One of the things is that I always trust that whoever is coming and needs to come and has that inkling is in a place where they're ready. And if we notice that they are not wanting to do the work, especially if I'm like assigning stuff, they're like, oh, I didn't have any time to do it. It's always an interesting moment because that then becomes the learning. And so, like I said, I kind of always trust that it's going to be there and then nothing is negated. You can't throw anything out as like, that's not important. And that's the thing that I love to me, which has made life so rich, is just to recognize that it's all here in service of your path towards self-love. And if that's the case, and if you're not doing your homework for yourself, your spiritual self journey is where it is, where can we take that? What do we do with that? And I think to your point, there are going to be a lot of people who really just love those miraculous moments, right? There's not time or material resources or anything like that in order to be able to go deeper. But there's so much processing that goes on after any of these moments, whether it's a moment with me or whether it's a moment with anybody who's able to really deliver that. Again, plant medicine ceremony, whether it's a holotropic breathwork ceremony, like whatever it is, there's so much that comes as a result of that. And we're learning everything from it. And we just have to be patient with whatever our journey is. And that's okay. We honor where everybody is in that moment. And if I have a soapbox, it's spiritual hierarchy. If there's anything that just like, really gets me going in a bad way is that. Because it's just another tool for separation if we say that we're ahead of somebody or we're something along those lines. And it is so important for us to recognize that we are all just waking up together. That was Ram Dass paraphrase, right? We're all just waking up. And it may feel like somebody's ahead or somebody's behind. There's so much to learn. There's no one curriculum.
And I'm sure you're learning too with every person that you work with.
Absolutely.
We'll exchange and energy and experience.
It is. We're just two divine beings in mortal bodies looking at each other being like, you got this? I think I got this. I got a little insight over here. You want to take it? Like that.
That's how we feel. That's for sure. Speaking of that, is there a go-to practice that you use in order to realign yourself?
So I'm a really big fan of heart-mind coherence, which the Heart Math Institute talks about, right? It's all about this idea that ultimately the heart has more neurons in it than the brain does. And if you let the heart rule the system, then the whole nervous system and everything is going to kind of really get in line. But with that same idea, my practice is this idea of first getting into heart-mind coherence, which is a really simple technique of instead of breathing in through your face, so to speak, you breathe and you imagine you're breathing directly into your chest. And you're breathing directly into your chest. And then you start breathing gratitude directly into your chest. And you're just slowing down and you're allowing yourself to really emphasize in your consciousness that your heart is the one who needs to create harmony with the mind, the gut brain, the human brain, and the heart brain to really get them all working together on a physiological level. So I always start off with that. And then if I find that I need energy, I go up and I go connect with my channel. I talk to it. This morning, I always have a song in my head, which is always relevant for the day. Today, I had like a classic psalm in my head, which was really strange, but today was a weird day. So it'll be like that. I go up and I go into my channel when I feel like I need energy, because there's nothing that's better for energizing me than going back up to that kind of source higher self. But if I really need more balancing and I need more grounding and I need to harmonize and kind of really add to that coherence, I go down and I ground. Right. Mm-hmm. And so we are ultimately this meeting point between source that sits above and the sink in many ways that sits below, that's there to catch our experience of being in this physical body. And the more that I can connect to the two of those and the more I can create coherence in all the systems, the better I can get through the day.
Love the simplicity of that.
You really articulated that in such a way that I think most people are going to be able to practice that for themselves. I love what you said about the song too.
Yeah, I really appreciate my DJ guide.
Right? Like we have a soundtrack to our lives. I believe that wholeheartedly.
It's so funny you say that because I always say in the morning, I feel like this random radio station and tuning in songs, a lot of them from my childhood that make no sense, but maybe I'll start to pay more attention to them now.
Yeah. Again, that's the other simple practice. Listen to the song and just wait and be curious about how it actually relates, because I can guarantee you it will. I mean, it's like imagine that there's things that are trying to come to you from your resistless state of dreaming. And it's like, well, the only thing we can do is leave this tape player running. It's going to either remind her of the dream or give her some guidance for today.
I love that.
Well, thank you so much, Kristina. We covered so many bases. I learned so much. And I also learned was just how much I appreciate you and this connection and you sharing your journeys and your abilities.
Thank you for allowing me to be here to do it.
Thinking like talking to that younger self who started out really from a place of trauma and loss and confusion and so much fear, really. And how cool that you just were able to adventure off into the world and really sample so many different cultures and experiences, and how much that filled up that cup that your dad was talking about at the very beginning and gave you all of those incredible perspectives now to be able to really be your guest back to the world. And that ultimately being reconnected with your mom, how that actually now is supporting you and now continuing to support all the work that you're doing for so many. I love your story. Thank you so much for sharing it. And I know people will love it too. It's so inspiring.
And your willingness to continue on the journey and continue to share with all of us so that we can connect with who we really are and our guru, as you said. So thank you, Kristina.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And to find out more about working with Kristina with a K, visit KristinaWiltsee.com. That's KristinaWiltsee.com. You can also listen to this Spiritual Fix podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, and we'll have all of this in our show notes as well. Thank you.
Thank you.